The crowd gathered as the sun rose over the grey rooftops of a changing Japan. Men, women, and even children pressed together in uneasy silence, their faces pale in the cold morning light. At the center of the square stood the scaffold, simple, brutal, final. The smell of damp earth mingled with the sharp scent of fresh-cut wood. And beyond, the castle walls loomed, silent witnesses to a spectacle that, after this day, would never be seen again. On this morning, in the heart of a nation torn between its ancient ways and the pull of a new world, Japan would carry out its last public execution. The man who would die beneath the executioner's blade was no noble warrior, no rebel leader, no enemy of the state. He was a thief, a murderer, and yet, by the accident of history, his death would mark the end of centuries of public bloodletting. His name would fade into obscurity, but the moment of his death would become legend. To understand how Japan reached this final act, we must step back into the closing years of the Edo period, a time when the nation stood balanced between shadow and light, between the sword and the steam engine, between isolation and the dawn of modernity. For over 2 centuries, Japan had lived under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, a rigid military government that enforced peace with an iron hand. Crime in this world was met with swift public punishment. Thieves lost their hands, rebels lost their heads, and murderers met death in front of the masses, their bodies left as warnings to all who might stray from the shogun's law. These executions were not just punishment, they were theater, ritual, and lesson. The condemned were paraded through the streets, jeered at by crowds, displayed at execution grounds where the entire town gathered to watch. The heads of criminals were mounted on stakes, their remains left to rot as a grim deterrent. But as the 19th century advanced, cracks began to show in the Tokugawa order. Foreign ships appeared on Japan's shores, black vessels billowing smoke, armed with cannon, bearing envoys who demanded trade, treaties, and the opening of Japan's long-closed gates. The arrival of Commodore Perry's fleet in 1853 shattered the illusion of isolation. With this shock came waves of change. The authority of the shogunate began to erode. The emperor's court in Kyoto stirred with new purpose. Merchants and scholars debated the future in tea-houses and behind paper screens. And among the many questions that arose was this: could Japan call itself a modern nation while clinging to the brutal spectacles of public execution? The world was watching. European envoys, American merchants, even Chinese exiles stood in the squares, witnessing the hangings and beheadings that once had been Japan's unquestioned custom. Their reports sent ripples across the seas. Japan was a land of beauty, of art, of discipline, but also a land of cruelty, frozen in time. Within Japan, reformers spoke out. Samurai who had studied abroad, scholars who read of European law, merchants eager for trade, all began to question the place of public execution in a country striving to join the community of nations. And so, slowly, the end of an era approached. But before the final curtain fell, there would be one last act. One final man would stand on the scaffold, kneel beneath the sword, and offer his life to a tradition soon to vanish forever. His name was Takahashi Oden, a man whose crimes were ordinary, whose fate was extraordinary. Condemned for murder and robbery, he would die not only for his sins, but as the last participant in a centuries-old ritual of blood and spectacle. In Part 1, we have entered the world that produced Japan's last public execution, a world of strict codes, public punishments, and a society on the brink of transformation. In Part 2, we will walk deeper into the twilight of the shogunate, explore the forces that led to the end of public executions, and meet the rulers who decided that the scaffold's time had passed. Join us as we trace the final steps toward the moment when the sword fell for the last time in view of the crowd. As the 19th century unfolded, the winds that swept across Japan were no longer the familiar breezes that rustled the bamboo groves and stirred the sails of fishing boats. These were foreign winds carrying the scent of coal smoke from distant lands, the echo of cannon fire, and the strange, insistent voices of diplomats, merchants, and missionaries. The Tokugawa shogunate, long the unchallenged master of Japan, found its foundations trembling beneath the weight of a world it could no longer ignore. The Tokugawa rulers had governed for over 250 years, enforcing peace through an intricate web of laws, customs, and punishments. Public executions had been one of their sharpest tools, a grim theater that reinforced the absolute power of the shogunate. Each swing of the executioner's sword was meant to remind the populace of the consequences of defiance. Heads displayed on pikes, bodies left to decay at crossroads or execution grounds. These were sights that had shaped generations, warnings etched into the collective memory of a nation. But now, those spectacles had begun to lose their terrible power. The black ships of Commodore Perry, which appeared off Japan's shores in 1853, forced open the gates of isolation. The treaties that followed humiliated the shogunate, stripping away control of tariffs and granting extraterritorial rights to foreigners. Worse, they revealed to the Japanese people that their rulers, for all their iron discipline, could not keep the world at bay. With the arrival of Westerners came more than trade goods and treaties. Ideas crossed the sea, ideas about law, justice, governance, and human rights. Foreign diplomats and envoys watched the executions that still took place in Japan's cities and towns, and they recoiled. Their reports described a land of contradiction, refined and cultured, yet clinging to barbaric customs. This foreign gaze mattered. The shogunate, already weakened by internal unrest and external pressures, began to feel the sting of shame. Could Japan hope to stand as an equal among nations while staging spectacles of death for the masses? Could it modernize its military, its industry, its government, and still cling to the scaffold and the sword? Within Japan itself, the call for change grew louder. Scholars and reformers, some inspired by Confucian ideals of governance, others by the writings of European thinkers, began to question not only public executions, but the entire system of justice that relied on fear and spectacle. Merchants eager for trade with the West, samurai returning from studies abroad, and even some officials within the shogunate saw the need to align Japan's laws with international norms. Yet the struggle was not simple. For every voice that called for reform, another rose in defense of tradition. To many within the shogunate, public executions were not shameful, they were necessary. They were the price of order in a society that had kept the peace for centuries. To abandon them was to risk chaos, to dishonor the ancestors, to invite rebellion and lawlessness. And rebellion was indeed in the air. Across the country, dissatisfaction with the shogunate's weakness fueled uprisings large and small. The Satsuma and Choshu domains, once loyal to the Tokugawa, turned against them. Samurai chafed at the humiliations imposed by the treaties. Peasants protested taxes and famine. The old order crumbled, and with it, the certainty that the scaffold could keep the nation united. In this climate of tension, the decision to end public executions was both symbolic and strategic. It was a gesture to the world, a signal that Japan was ready to join the community of modern nations. It was also a move to placate reformers and calm the growing unease within the cities. The scaffold had become not a tool of stability, but a reminder of an era slipping into the past. The final years of the Edo period saw the practice of public execution dwindle. Hangings and beheadings still occurred, but fewer and fewer were staged for the crowds. The shogunate, once eager to make examples of criminals, now preferred to deal with them quietly, behind the walls of prisons and compounds. Yet the end would not come cleanly. The last public execution, that of Takahashi Oden, was both a farewell to a tradition and a reluctant nod to change. The decision to carry out the sentence publicly was made in a time of uncertainty, as the shogunate sought to project strength even as its authority waned. Oden's death was meant to remind the people that the law still ruled, but instead it became a marker of the law's decline, a final act in a drama that had played out for centuries. In Part 2, we have seen the forces that pushed Japan to abandon public execution, the pressure of foreign powers, the calls for reform, the cracks in the shogunate's rule. But in Part 3, we will walk to the scaffold itself. We will meet the condemned man, the executioner, and the crowd that gathered one last time to witness the blade's fall. Join us as we draw closer to the moment when Japan's ancient ritual of public justice met its end on the edge of a sword. It was a cold, pale morning in 1871, the kind that settles into the bones and makes even the boldest whisper quieter. The streets of Tokyo, no longer Edo, but not yet modern, stirred as word spread. There would be an execution that day, one final public reckoning at the edge of a sword. The people gathered as they had for generations, but this time the air carried a strange, heavy stillness, as if the city itself knew this would be the last. The execution ground lay on the outskirts of the city, beyond the bustle of market stalls and the orderly lines of wooden houses. The scaffold stood stark and bare, built from rough timbers, as if the builders had known no one would need to see its like again. Around it, the earth was packed hard from centuries of footsteps, executioners, condemned men, curious crowds, and today, for the last time, it would bear witness to blood. The crowd came early. Merchants, laborers, samurai, farmers drawn by duty, curiosity, habit. Children clung to their mothers' sleeves, eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. Old men who had seen 100 such spectacles muttered prayers beneath their breath. And the foreigners, diplomats, traders, missionaries stood apart, their faces unreadable, taking in a sight that had become rare even in this land of ancient ways. At the heart of this grim theater stood the condemned man, Takahashi Oden. His name would soon be forgotten, but for now, all eyes fixed upon him. His crime had been simple and brutal robbery, murder. But his fate was extraordinary, for he was to be the last man in Japan to meet death before the assembled eyes of the people. Oden was no hero, no noble rebel. He did not stand tall beneath the scaffold's shadow. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of fear and resignation. His hands were bound, his feet bare upon the cold earth. His robes, once white, were stained with the dust of the prison and the sweat of sleepless nights. Beside him stood the executioner, a man chosen not for cruelty, but for precision. His robes were dark, his face calm, his hands steady on the hilt of his sword. This was not a task of anger or passion. It was duty, honed by centuries of practice, passed down from father to son, master to apprentice. His blade was sharp enough to sever life in a single stroke, honed on stones wetted with the tears of many before. The officials read the sentence aloud, their voices carrying across the silent square. No cries interrupted, no pleas for mercy. Oden knew, as all condemned had known before him, that there would be no reprieve. The law had spoken, the people had gathered, the blade would fall. The executioner stepped forward, the sword glinting in the pale light. The crowd held its breath. Mothers drew their children close. The air seemed to thicken, every sound sharper, the soft rustle of robes, the creak of the scaffold's boards, the distant caw of a crow. Oden was made to kneel, his head bent forward, neck bared to the blade's edge. The executioner raised his sword, high and sure, and for a heartbeat all of Tokyo seemed to freeze. The moment hung between worlds, between past and future, tradition and change, death and what lay beyond. Then the blade fell. A single stroke, clean and final. The head of Takahashi Oden dropped to the ground, the last to do so before the watching eyes of the people. The executioner stepped back, sword lowered, duty done. A murmur rose from the crowd, low and uneasy. Some turned away, sickened or sorrowful. Others stared, as if trying to etch the scene into memory. The foreigners among them took note, knowing they had seen the end of an age. The officials signaled, and the body was removed. The scaffold stood empty, the blood darkening the earth beneath. The people began to drift away, their voices low, their footsteps heavy. The children clung tighter to their mothers' hands. The old men bowed their heads. No one cheered, no one jeered. This was not spectacle anymore, it was an ending. In that square, as the last traces of the crowd disappeared, the scaffold remained stark against the grey sky, a monument to a custom that had shaped Japan for centuries. But it would stand empty from that day forward, its purpose fulfilled, its time past. In Part 3, we have walked to the scaffold, stood among the crowd, and witnessed the final public execution of Japan. In Part 4, we will step back from the moment of death and explore the reactions, the aftermath, and the quiet dismantling of a tradition that had defined the rule of law for generations. Join us as we follow the echoes of the sword's last fall and trace how Japan turned its face fully toward a new age. When the crowd finally dispersed and the square emptied, a deep and uncanny quiet settled over the execution ground. The scaffold, once the stage for centuries of punishment and power, stood empty beneath the pale sky. The earth, stained dark where Takahashi Oden's blood had fallen, seemed to drink in the last offering of an age. The final public execution in Japan was over, but its echoes would carry far beyond the city walls. Across Tokyo, the event became the murmur on every lip. In tea-houses and markets, in the homes of samurai and the shops of merchants, people spoke of the final act they had witnessed. Some described it with unease, the clean fall of the blade, the lifeless body, the unnatural stillness of the crowd. Others recalled it with relief, as if sensing that something old and cruel had been laid to rest along with the condemned man. But among the rulers and scholars, the reaction was sharper, more deliberate. The officials of the new Meiji government, many of them reformers, eager to reshape Japan's image and its future, saw in Oden's execution the closing of a chapter. They understood what the crowd had felt in their bones, that public death had lost its place in a nation racing toward modernity. The foreign observers who had stood at the edge of the crowd sent their dispatches across the seas. In Europe's capitals and America's cities, newspapers printed the story. Japan had carried out its last public beheading. The reports painted a complex portrait, a nation of ancient discipline and honor, but one stepping reluctantly into a new age where the scaffold would no longer command the square. Behind the scenes, the Meiji leaders moved quickly. They issued new edicts, quietly dismantling the structures that had supported public executions. The scaffold was taken down, its timbers repurposed or burned. The execution grounds, once places of gathering and grim spectacle, fell silent, overgrown or built over by the expanding city. For the executioners themselves, the change was profound. Once figures of respect and fear, masters of a deadly art passed down through generations, they found their role vanishing. Some turned to other trades. Others remained in service, carrying out the rare and increasingly private sentences that followed. The sword, once raised before thousands, now fell in secrecy, behind prison walls, witnessed only by officials. And what of the people? For generations, they had been taught that justice was something seen, that the rule of law was made visible through the spectacle of punishment. Now they faced a different reality, one where justice became hidden, administered quietly, no longer a lesson in blood and fear. The shift was not easy. Some grieved the loss of tradition, others welcomed the change, hoping it signaled a gentler, wiser age. Among the samurai class, the end of public execution was one of many signs that their world was passing. The Meiji Restoration stripped them of their privileges, their swords, their place in the social order. The scaffold's dismantling was another reminder that the code they had lived by, where honor and death were bound together, no longer ruled the land. Yet the true significance of Oden's execution lay not only in what it ended, but in what it revealed. It marked the point where Japan, in the eyes of its own people and of the watching world, chose to turn its back on the past, or at least on one of its darkest customs. The final public death was a bridge between eras, one foot still in the feudal world of shoguns and samurai, the other stepping onto the uncertain path of modern nationhood. The city itself changed quickly. Where crowds had once gathered to witness the law's harshest judgment, train stations, factories, and new government buildings rose. The places where the scaffold had stood were swallowed by the rush of modern life. And as years turned into decades, the memory of the last execution faded, replaced by the stories of industrial success, military victories, and national reform. But for those who had stood in that square on that cold morning, the memory never left entirely. They remembered the strange stillness, the clean fall of the blade, the weight of knowing they had seen an ending. And for Japan, even as it raced into the modern age, that memory remained in the background, a reminder of the cost of change and of the ancient shadows from which it had emerged. In Part 4, we have walked through the aftermath, the dismantling of the scaffold, the transformation of justice, the quiet acceptance of a new way. But in Part 5, we will step back once more and ask, what legacy did the last public execution leave? How did it shape Japan's understanding of law, power, and humanity in the decades that followed? And what echoes of that final beheading can still be heard today? Join us as we close this story of blood and change and reflect on the shadow that the last public execution of Japan still casts across history. The scaffold is long gone. The timbers that once supported it have rotted, burned, or been repurposed. The earth beneath the execution grounds has been paved over, built upon, transformed into the streets and structures of modern Tokyo. And yet, the shadow of that final public execution, the beheading of Takahashi Oden, lingers still, woven into the fabric of Japan's history, a silent reminder of a nation's journey from feudal order to modern statehood. The legacy of that last public spectacle is complex. For some, it marked the end of barbarity, a necessary break from a past where law was enforced with fear and death displayed for all to see. For others, it was the moment when a piece of Japan's identity was surrendered, when centuries of tradition were abandoned in the name of progress, leaving behind questions about what had been gained and what had been lost. The Meiji government, in the years that followed, moved swiftly to reshape Japan's system of justice. Public executions were abolished. Capital punishment, when carried out, became hidden behind the walls of prisons, witnessed only by officials, no longer a spectacle for the masses. The state, eager to present itself as a civilized, modern power to the eyes of the West, embraced the idea that justice should no longer be a public performance. Yet, the memories of public execution did not vanish so easily. In the decades that followed, they lived on in folk tales, in the whispered stories of elders, in the woodblock prints and ballads that recorded the last acts of the scaffold. People remembered not just the sight of the blade's fall, but the weight of the silence that followed, the strange stillness that signaled a world passing away. For Japan's rulers, the final public execution became a symbol of transition. It reminded them that the old tools of control, spectacle, fear, and public punishment no longer held the same power in a society rushing toward industrialization, constitutional government, and participation on the global stage. The sword's final fall taught that modern power required different instruments: education, economic strength, law applied quietly but firmly behind closed doors. And yet, even as public executions ended, the death penalty itself did not. Japan retained capital punishment, and debates over its use continued across generations. The echoes of that final beheading shaped those debates, casting a long shadow over how the country balanced justice, tradition, and human rights. In a deeper sense, the legacy of the last public execution challenges us to ask difficult questions, not just about Japan, but about any society that has struggled with the tension between tradition and change. When does a custom, long accepted, become a burden? How do nations honor their past while embracing the future? And what is the cost, to rulers and to people alike, of turning acts of law into spectacles of death? Visitors to Tokyo today might walk the streets where the scaffold once stood, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The markets hum, the trains roar, the towers of steel and glass catch the sun where once crowds gathered to watch the law's blade fall. But for those who know the story, the memory lingers. It reminds us that even in a city transformed, the shadows of history remain silent, but never truly gone. The last public execution in Japan is more than a date on a timeline or a fact in a textbook. It is a mirror held up to a moment when a nation stood between two worlds, the world of samurai, shoguns, and the scaffold, and the world of factories, parliaments, and diplomacy. The clean fall of the blade marked not just a man's death, but the passing of an age. And so, as we close this chapter of dark history, we look back not with judgment, but with understanding. The end of public execution was not simply the end of cruelty. It was the beginning of a new set of challenges: how to build justice without terror, how to enforce law without spectacle, how to remember the past without becoming trapped by it. Japan met those challenges with determination, stumbling at times, but always moving forward. The scaffold's shadow faded, but the questions it posed remain as urgent today as they were on that cold morning when Takahashi Oden knelt for the last time before the crowd. Our journey through the final public execution of Japan ends here, but the exploration of dark history continues. In our next story, we may uncover the secrets of ancient assassins, the rise and fall of forbidden cults, or the cursed treasures that doomed kings and emperors. The shadows of history are deep, and together we will keep shining a light into their darkest corners. Subscribe, share, and join us for the next tale of blood, power, and the hidden truths of our past. The story is far from over.